Before this video begins, I would like to inform you that this video was worked on over a 2-month period from late May to late July 2018 and was my first documentary video. As a result, it is not up to what I would consider the current Pennsy Productions quality standard. That being said, I have made quality improvements here and there recently, but please keep in mind that this is not the quality you can expect from Pennsy Productions. Now, on to our feature presentation. Imagine it's the 1940s. Imagine hearing a lonesome whistle in the night. Imagine feeling the ground shake as 400 tons of steel rumbles by. Imagine seeing the brute under its own power. Once a common sight, the steam locomotive has become very rare to see under its own power today. Fortunately, many individuals or groups have saved steam locomotives to restore and put into excursion service, whether it's from a display piece in a city park or a scrapyard. Some locomotives that were restored a long time ago still operate excursions today, but others, however, do not. Whether they're under restoration right now or have been completely scrapped. This is my list of the top 10 retired steam excursion stars. Number 10, Grand Trunk Western 5629. This 462 Pacific locomotive was built by Alco, and it was bought by Richard Jensen from the Grand Trunk Western in 1959. He and some other volunteers restored it to running condition in 1961, when it started pulling excursions on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Throughout the 1960s, it pulled excursions through Chicago, Detroit, and other major cities in the Midwest. From 1967 to 1968, it pulled the Schlitz Circus train from Maryland to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. However, in the 1970s, 5629's luck began to change. In the 70s, Jensen broke his back during a refrigerator accident, and therefore could no longer afford to have 5629 run excursions. It was eventually moved to the Rock Island Blue Yard Complex for storage, but in the 1980s, the Rock Island Railroad filed for abandonment, and Metra acquired the yard complex. Metra offered Jensen to move the locomotives to the Iowa Interstate Railroad, but they wouldn't assist him getting it there. Eventually, Metra and Jensen got into a huge argument, and they ruled out that if the locomotive wasn't moved out of the complex, it would be scrapped. Word got around about this, and as a result, many individuals and groups attempted to save it from its demise, including the Illinois Railway Museum, but nothing worked. Metra sent out a salvage crew and scrapped the locomotive where it stood. All rail fans could do was watch with horror and disbelief as the once preserved engine was cut up. Jensen was also disgusted after the events he went through, and on March 16, 1991, he passed away. Fortunately, 2 of 5629's sister engines survive today, so the locomotive class lives on. Number 9, Lake Superior and Ishpeming 34, also known as Western Maryland 734. This mighty 280 was built in 1916 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works for the Lake Superior and Ishpeming Railroad, numbered as 34. The locomotive was retired in 1951 and stayed on the company's deadline in Marquette, Michigan until 1963. That year, 34 and 2 of her sisters, 33 and 35, were sold to the Marquette and Mountain Tourist Railroad to operate, but that deal never worked out. 33 was bought by Jerry Jacobson for his collection of locomotives, where it remains to this day. 34 and 35 were both sold to the Illinois Railway Museum, where 35 remains to this day. Fortunately, 34 didn't have to remain a display piece for long. 1991, 34 was bought by the former Allegheny Central Scenic Railroad, rebranding themselves as the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad. They were making this change because the railroad consisted of the former Western Maryland main line. 34 was restored to running condition in 1993, dressed up as a Western Maryland 734, which worked much more like a typical Western Maryland 280. During its career, the locomotive was extremely popular in excursions between the round trips from Cumberland to Frostburg, Maryland. However, in 2016, the locomotive was temporarily retired for its federally mandated inspection and overhaul. In 2014, Western Maryland acquired a C&O 2662 Mallet from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland to restore and operate on their line instead of 734. This locomotive was recently test-fired, and the project to restore it is nearing completion. The work to restore the Mallet must be finished in order for work on 734 to begin. Luckily, both of 734's preserved sisters, 33 and 35, are still around. In fact, 33 operated on the Ohio Central Railroad in Northeast Ohio for a short period of time in 2008. Number 8, Nickel Plate Road 759. This powerful 284 locomotive was built in August 1944 by Lima Locomotive Works for freight and passenger service on the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, often shortened to the Nickel Plate Road. This locomotive, along with all of her sisters, was retired in June of 1958. In 1962, the locomotive was purchased by F. Nelson Blount for a Steamtown, USA collection and moved to North Walpole, New Hampshire. It would later be moved once more to Bellows Falls, Vermont. In 1967, Ross Rowland made a deal with Blount that would return 759 to service for steam-powered excursions hosted by his High Iron Company. The locomotive was taken to a former nickel plate roundhouse in Conneaut, Ohio, for a short restoration and testing. It pulled its first excursion to Buffalo, New York on August 30th, 1968. She was extremely popular during her excursion career, pulling many excursion trips. Some of the most popular included the Golden Spikes at Temeo Limited, trips around the Horseshoe Curve, and the last Pocahontas passenger train on Norfolk and Western before Amtrak took over all passenger service. After a few excursions in late 1973, 759 was placed into storage at the Delaware and Hudson's Roundhouse in Rouse's Point, New York. Unfortunately, the D&H never drained the locomotive's boiler, and all remaining water in it froze, causing severe damage to many boiler flues. Steamtown sued D&H for the damages to the locomotive and won. As a settlement, the D&H made some repairs to the locomotive, and 759 was test-fired in 1975. Some more repairs were made to get the locomotive legally operational, But after a flue failed during a hydrostatic test in 1977, it was decided that the locomotive would remain a static display. Today, 759 is on display at Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania, now owned by the National Park Service. 5 other nickel-plate Berkshires are still preserved, and one of them, nickel-plate 765, is still operational today, based out of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and running public excursions in Chicago and Northeast Ohio. Number 7, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, 5632. One of 28 484s built in Burlington's own locomotive shops, 5632 was built in 1940. On November 2, 1958, the locomotive was pulled out of retirement to participate in the Burlington steam program, along with 282 Mikado number 4960. In 1964, 5632 was painted gold to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the CB&Q. Unfortunately, 5632's luck would soon begin to change. In 1965, the president of Burlington at that time, Harry C. Murphy, ordered that the locomotive be overhauled. The next year, however, Murphy retired and Lewis W. Menck succeeded him. Menck had no interest in running steam, and as a result, 5632 was sold to Richard Jensen. He stored the locomotive in the former Chicago and Western Illinois Roundhouse in Chicago. The locomotive needed over $100,000 of repairs in 1966, which would be over $773,000 today. On a Saturday morning in August 1969, Jensen received a telegram stating that he had 48 hours to vacate the premises. The Chicago and Western Illinois moved all of Jensen's equipment being stored there to a scrapyard. Unfortunately, 5632 derailed while being moved into the scrapyard, and with no way to get the locomotive back on the track, the once glorious steam excursion queen was scrapped where it sat. The same fate that Grand Trunk 5629 would suffer 16 years later. Fortunately, 5632 has 4 other surviving sister engines, and her sister engine in the steam program, Burlington 4960, still runs trips today on the famed Grand Canyon Railway in Williams, Arizona. Number 6, Chesapeake and Ohio 2716. Another powerful 284 locomotive. This brute was built in December 1943 by Alco for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. Most railroads referred to their 284s as Berkshires, but C&O named their 284s Kanawhas after the Kanawha River. This locomotive, along with all of her sisters, was retired in 1956. In 1959, 2716 was donated to the Kentucky Railway Museum, where it sat on display for 20 years. In 1979, the locomotive was leased by the Clinchfield Railroad for their steam program, but not long afterward, the program ended because its parent company, Seaboard Coastline Industries, fired the general manager of Clinchfield for participating in the scandal. Coincidentally, around the same time that happened, the Southern Railway was looking for a locomotive for their steam program. So in 1981, the railway leased the locomotive from the Kentucky Railway Museum to restore. It was taken to their Irondale, Alabama shops, and after a test run on October 10th and 11th of that year, it pulled its first excursion on October 17th and 18th from Chattanooga to Rockwood, Tennessee. The locomotive was disguised as Southern 2716, a fantasy paint scheme to imitate what a Southern Berkshire might look like if they ever ordered one. However, in July of 1982, the locomotive was discovered to have cracks in its firebox, which dampened its performance, figuratively and literally. This took the engine out of service, and nickel plate 765 was called in as a replacement. After the Southern Railway merged with Norfolk and Western to create Norfolk Southern, 2 Norfolk and Western locomotives were used in their steam program instead. For the next 13 years, 2716 was stored at Norfolk Southern's Birmingham shops. In 1994, nickel plate 765 was taken out of service for a federally mandated inspection and overhaul. During that time, the owners of the locomotive, the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society, were left without locomotives, so they moved the 2716 to their facilities in 1995. They solved the firebox problems, and the next year, the locomotive was restored back to its original C&O appearance and operated excursions for a little while in Indiana. Unfortunately, soon after, it was found that 2716's tubes were close to expiring. The Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society then had a tough decision to make: restore the 765 and get a like-new locomotive out of it, or put new flues in 2716 and keep her running. In the end, the decision was made to rebuild nickel plate 765. A major overhaul was performed from 2000 to 2005 that brought the locomotive back to like-new condition, and the 765 can still be seen in operation today. March 2001, the 2716 was taken back to the Kentucky Railway Museum and placed under a shelter. Fortunately, all hope is not lost for 2716. On February 7, 2016, the Kentucky Steam Heritage Corporation announced that they signed a lease with the Kentucky Railway Museum and were going to restore 2716 to running condition. Current estimates place the completion date for the restoration at sometime during 2020, and 11 other C&O canals survive today, so 2716's class is still well represented. As it turns out, this list was too long to fit into one video, so to watch entries 5, 4, and 3, please proceed to part 2.